All right, and we're live. Hey, y'all, this is Stevie with Redneck Economics. And tonight I have Robbie Jaeger. Finally, I know I've been telling everybody, for a couple of weeks now, like, oh, I'm going to have Robbie on. But we finally, third time's a charm. So we finally made it work today. And I'm very excited to have this discussion. Welcome to my channel, Robbie.
Yeah, appreciate you having me on. I know we did kind of have like a little hiccup there. One, I kicked it off by being a bonehead and not knowing what Saturday was which, and things just went on from there. But hey, like you said, third time is a charm. So I really appreciate you having me on to talk about all this for real.
Oh yeah, I mean, definitely. I mean, well, then I did the same move like the next weekend because it was my husband's birthday. So
yeah, well, hey,
no
I can't say anything, obviously. Look,
better late than never. So.
Absolutely, yep.
Well, it's good to have you here. I mean, and I was just talking to Robbie earlier, just a few minutes ago. You don't have any training in this, and that's what is like so mind blowing to me. It's just like you are completely self taught. I mean, just from reading your articles and watching you present this information, the way that you can, the way that you write, and the way that you investigate. I mean, it is seriously impressive the work that you've done on this. It has taken a lot of work, I can tell.
Well, I appreciate that. Like I was saying, it's been a bit of trial and error. I was always of the opinion, once I did get started doing this, that, the best way to go about it is to find source documents, right? That way you don't have to deal with the anonymous source or this or that. You can actually state what the document says, and you can show the document to back up your work. It actually makes the job so much easier. But I've been a sponge, in other areas. I have, studied in my spare time just to learn more about the areas and things that I cover, and watching other great journalists and how they write and how they, their phrasings and how they formulate articles to best get their points across. But yeah, I'm a work in progress. I feel like, I still, hopefully I can keep it up and just continue to get better. But yeah, I mean, I appreciate it though, for real. Cause it does take a lot of work sometimes, especially when you've got other jobs and stuff. So I'm usually up pretty late night, just looking through documents and stuff that would put most people to sleep. But for some reason I find it interesting. So.
Well, I mean, the passion for what you're doing, I mean, really shines through. So, what got you started? I mean, I know that you started writing about a year or two ago.
Yep.
But what was like the inciting, event?
Well, I'm not sure if there was an event. I did get really inspired by WikiLeaks and doing this during the 2016 cycle, because while I do remember their older releases and stuff like that, the Podesta emails, the Clinton emails, the DNC emails, which, by the way, we're all very, very much relevant and in the public interest. So, they did everyone a service by releasing it. That's what journalists are supposed to do. But I just saw, again, how there could be no question of of what they were reporting, because they were letting the documents speak for themselves. And it was actually a WikiLeaks email that got me interested enough. There was a couple of people mentioned in the email. I looked up who they were, and I just hopped down a rabbit hole and just took notes, wrote down what I found. And I just, something compelled me. I don't know what it was. Maybe it was just like, the need to be creative or write something or contribute something. So I wrote it down in the form of an article, what I found, and it blew up, which, kind of inspired me to do more. So I did more. And, like I said, it's been about a year and a half now since I've been doing it, and time flies because I feel like I just started. And in the grand scheme of things, I probably just, I definitely just did start. But yeah, I mean, I feel like I've been doing it. Sometimes I feel like, for forever. Sometimes I feel like I don't know what I'm doing. So it's weird like that, I guess.
Well, I mean, I'm looking forward to seeing like the kind of work that you're doing, 2, 4, 10 years from now. Yeah. Hopefully, we won't need that kind of work, in the future as much.
Yeah. Best case scenario.
But yeah, I mean, just I mean, considering how much you've done in the short amount of time that you've been doing it, I mean, it's pretty impressive.
Well, thank you.
But what really caught my eye, and this is the first time I heard about you, was I saw you, I think it was on Slow News Day, and you were
Mhm.
talking about the Colonial pipeline disaster.
Yeah.
So when did that happen?
Okay. So here's the background on that, right? So it's kind of a saga of sorts. I'll try to go through it as quickly as possible. So it goes back to August 14th of 2020. Where that is where outside of Charlotte, North Carolina, in a place called Huntersville, there was a leak that was discovered that was first reported by a couple of teenagers bicycling through the Oler Nature Preserve, like I said, in Huntersville. They smelled gasoline. They reported it. Colonial Pipeline, who, by the way, is probably one of the largest pipelines in America, one of the largest natural gas pipelines in America, definitely on the East Coast. It runs through like a dozen states. That's 5,500 miles long. Massive thing. So, they initially told state regulators that the leak in question was 63,000 gallons, right? So while that does sound like a significant number, unfortunately, it's not going to make many headlines nationally. So fast forward a couple of months, some discrepancies in their reporting had basically spurred state regulators to ask them to revise those estimates. And they came back in November and said, okay, it's probably close to 250,000 gallons. Which state regulators looked at and said, no, I think that's still too low. Give us better numbers. And then finally, in January of this year, Colonial Pipeline said that the spill was actually probably about 1.2 million gallons of gas, which, given their initial estimate and then what they wound up with 4 months later, that's an insane discrepancy. Just no matter how you can slice it, like you expect estimates to go up in situations like this, but not that far up. That's crazy. So that's what got me interested on the story. Was just like, I mean, what nobody's talking about it, for one. I mean, I thought that once I saw it, then everybody else was going to see it with me and it would just kind of blow up, but it never did. So I was like, okay, well, I'm gonna just see what I can find. And my reporting started on this basically when I looked into their inspection records, basically how they've been inspecting their pipeline over the last couple of years. And as I mentioned before, it's a 5,500-mile pipeline. But in 2019, they inspected only at most 45% of it. Um, Now, specifically, this leak came through a crack, right? So in 2019, they only checked 650 miles of their entire pipeline for cracks. And if that's bad enough, you can go back to 2018 and their records show that they only inspected 150 miles of the pipeline that year for cracks.
Wow.
So
And
go ahead.
is there anybody what agency, or is there an agency that's supposed to like oversee this?
Sure. So yeah, the federal agency in charge of pipeline oversight is actually under the Department of Transportation, believe it or not. And it's the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration. That's a kind of a weird acronym. I call it PIMSA, right? They're the federal authority. And unfortunately, they haven't really been so much as of the way that when I'm looking at these reports and I'm looking at the history of incidents, by the way, of which Colonial Pipeline has numerous. And basically, let's just say this: since 2017 began, they've had over 63 incidents reported to PIMSA, both big and small, and they've done like somewhere in the ballpark of like $60 million in damage to the either the environment or property in that time span. So you know but it doesn't look like PIMSA is much in the in the way of preventing these things. It looks like they're just in the way of responding to things that basically that they have no other choice but to respond to. I feel like, because most of the times from what I can tell, they're just sending strongly worded letters to these companies and saying you have 30 days to change this, that, and the third, or we'll send you another strongly worded letter.
Finger
But
wagging. That,
yeah,
that gets a lot done.
right. And kind of one of the latest breaks on this, is that, during their investigation that PIMSA has been doing into Colonial Pipeline, specifically that incident. Actually, I just dropped my notes on the ground. Here it is. So they just actually came out with a report of their own regarding Colonial Pipeline, and basically, this is what it says. They basically called it a ticking time bomb that is a accident waiting to happen and a risk to public safety throughout the entirety of the pipeline. If you don't mind, I'd like to quote this report just a couple of times here.
Yeah, go for it.
So it basically referencing the 1.2 million gallon spill in North Carolina. It says Colonial's inability to effectively detect and respond to this release, as well as other past releases, has potentially exacerbated the impacts of this and numerous other failures over the operational history of Colonial's entire system. Basically saying that not only are they inadequate in their response and detection capability, but they've been inadequate for a long time. And while it's nice to hear that coming from the federal agency that's supposed to be overseeing them, it also begs the question is that, well, if you know that they're inadequately doing these things and they've been inadequate at these things for such a long time now, what's taking you guys so long to get to this point? So, like I said, this issue, and I guess I can wrap back around to this at the end, is that this issue is sometimes it's almost as much about the regulators as it is about Colonial Pipeline, right? Because there's room for improvement definitely on Colonial side, but we need an entire shakeup on the regulatory side, because right now there's just they're too lax. So the report goes on to say that, after evaluating the preliminary findings of fact and considering the characteristics of the Colonial Pipeline system, as well as the failure history of that system, it appears that the continued operation of the Colonial Pipeline system without corrective measures would pose a pipeline integrity risk to public safety, property, and the environment. And it also says the conditions and threats of prior similar repairs. And when they say the similar repairs, quickly, it basically is referencing the crack that this 1.2 million gallons spilled from was at the site of a previous repair, right? So when it says that the conditions and threats at locations of prior similar repairs potentially exist throughout the Colonial Pipeline system, meaning at any point throughout the entire 5,500 miles of this pipeline, at any point that they've made a similar repair as to the one that spilled in North Carolina or cracked in North Carolina, you have the potential for a catastrophic level leak. And here's the problem with that specifically, is that the leak in North Carolina wasn't detected until possibly weeks after the leak had started, because Colonial Pipeline, as we also find out in this report, most of their inspection methods, specifically on that stretch of pipe where this leak occurred, were, as they call it, predominantly manual. They basically have a human tracking the volumes of gasoline flowing from station to station and making sure that, hey, within a certain variance, is this the same amount of gas we put in, coming out the other end, right? When you have a huge discrepancy, that's when you start saying, okay, we probably have a leak somewhere. But there are automated tools to do this, and lots of pipelines use state-of-the-art automated tools to do these things. And Colonial Pipeline, while they apparently do use them in some parts of their pipeline, they do not use those on line one, as they call it, which is one of the largest parts of their pipeline. So, basically it just goes on to say that they have like 90 days to come up with a full evaluation of their they have of their inspection system, right? And then that's going to get reviewed by a third party. They'll send back, there's going to be a bunch of little bureaucratic stuff, right? They're going to have to review and overhaul certain things, or under penalty of a fine or whatnot. They also, though, have to report every single repair, like similar to the one that cracked, that they've made to that pipeline. Probably, I think it was like over the last 20 some odd years or so, which again, and this is the point I like to make on this, why this is significant, is because if we had a map of Colonial Pipeline and it runs from Texas all the way up, to New England, that we could stick not knowing where these repairs were made, if we were to stick a pin in every single point along the route, where a repair such as the one that was cracked was made, it would really show you how at risk the entire East Coast is, from a catastrophic spill. Like them or love or not, federal government just basically designated one of the largest pipelines in America as a ticking time bomb, a public safety risk. And yet, unfortunately, nobody's outraged about it. Nobody's talking about it, because nobody knows about it. And that's a failure on the media and activists' part. And when I say media, I don't mean indie journos like you or I, because obviously we're talking about it now. But this is something that's definitely been on the radar. And I know that people that have influence have seen this story and they've just disregarded it. So yeah, I mean, that's the problem. I don't know. This definitely, I feel like, has huge ramifications, but I feel like I've been talking for forever. So feel free to
No, I
hop
mean,
in
this
whenever.
is all very important information. So Anthony Reyes in the chat, he had a question for you. He wanted to know if the body overseeing this shows any differences between the Trump and the Biden administration.
No, not at all. Not well, okay. So while I haven't seen such a scathing report, as where they're absolutely slamming them in this report, condemning them as a safety risk, they're really sticking it to them. I mean, as far as strongly worded letters go, I will say this is probably the strongest worded letter I've read while digging through these reports. So I mean, as far as that goes, I mean, so far it's been nothing but finger wagging still. But I will like to add that the investigation, is still ongoing, and that, there are still, I feel like there's the likelihood of big fines coming down the pipe, no pun intended. But so we'll have to wait and see, really. I can tell you the EPA isn't any different under Biden's administration, because, and I can tell you that firsthand, because when I first contacted the EPA about this bill and I asked them, this was back in January, if they were investigating it at all. And they said they had already been out there, and that, the drinking, and I'm paraphrasing, right? I'd have to actually search for the statement. I've still got it somewhere. It's on Twitter, actually, somewhere. But regardless of that, the statement they gave me was basically the drinking water isn't contaminated in the area and the air quality is fine. So we're going to kick this can down the road to, the North Carolina Department of Environmental Quality, and, we're going to move on. Regardless of the fact that there was like, I don't know what it was, like 4,000 times the allowable amount of cancer-causing agents such as benzene in the groundwater in the area. But because it wasn't in drinking water, I guess, and this is my gripe with that, because I feel like I would have gotten the same response from the Trump administration's EPA. And, that's kind of disappointing. But also the fact that, what does the EPA actually do? Because
I'd love to know that.
Well, here's the thing. I mean, you probably heard the saying, just like I have, is that, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, right? And by that, whenever you talk about protection, well, the best form of protection in pretty much any scenario is prevention of the thing that you would have to be protected from, is to prevent those situations from occurring. So somebody please explain to me how the Environmental Protection Agency is protecting anything if they only show up after the damage is done. Uh, you know, they should have something to say more than what they have said regarding that. I mean, because quite honestly, here's the problem with the way that this is where we get kind of away from Colonial Pipeline. I mean, I could yell out stats about them all day long. There's been since the year 2000, there's been over 2,750 pipeline spills in the United States. Colonial Pipeline is responsible for 1 in 10 of them. Wow. 1 in every 10. In North Carolina alone, in the same amount of time, there's been 38 pipeline spills. And Colonial Pipeline is responsible for 32 of those. That's a spill, not just an incident at like a tanking facility or something like that. That is a spill around every 8 months for the last 20 years, which is the analogy I've been using is that we have a multi-billion-dollar pipeline that's having accidents at the exact same or maybe even a greater frequency than your average forklift operator, which I find to be completely unacceptable. And everyone else should as well. And here's another thing, with Colonial was that it's old. It's old as dirt. I mean, as far as a piece of infrastructure goes, it probably hasn't seen much care since it was started construction in the 1960s. It basically every like 720 some of the like 800 some odd miles of the pipeline that run through North Carolina were built before 1980. So almost all of it is at least 40 years old. But here's the catch.
I think you said it was about 80% is over 40 years old. I mean, how is that even acceptable? I mean,
well,
that just never happened.
Yeah, but here's the worst part is that PIMSA only requires them to inspect it once every 5 years. So that basically, I guess that and I've never been able to really achieve clarification on this. It's obviously not a case of inspecting it one time, 1 year every 5 years, because they perform inspections every year and they have to report the results of those inspections every year. But it also doesn't seem, is it like a rolling? You have to have completed an entire inspection of your pipeline over the course of this 5-year period. I've never really been able to get clarification on how the actual 5 years things work. But regardless of that, for a 40-year-old pipeline, you should be inspecting it every year. And if you don't have the technology or the manpower to do that, well, then that's your problem, honestly, because Colonial Pipeline made like $1.3 billion last year. Their net profits actually went up 3% from the previous year. Pandemic did not affect them at all. So you can afford to hire the extra manpower. You can afford to buy the latest and greatest technology to do this. But here's the problem we've had so far with regulations is that obviously they're weak. 5 years is unacceptable by any stretch. And then also they only seem to lay down fines when publicly they really have no other option for like the smaller stuff, the smaller leaks, the 600-gallon leaks. Unless you're getting news footage of it floating in the San Francisco Bay, Chevron will probably be fined for that because of but if this happened in a field somewhere in Wyoming, they'd probably just get a strongly worded letter about it. And that seems to be PIMSA's, MO for the past, I don't know, decade or so at least. And also is that the oil and gas industry have trade associations just like almost every other industry, right? The largest one of those being the American Petroleum Institute. It's got like over 600 member oil and gas pipeline companies, not just pipeline. I'm talking about oil and gas like Exxon, BP, Shell, pipeline companies like Colonial, Enbridge, Kinder Morgan, all these guys. And they're the most powerful and influential oil and gas trade association in the country, maybe the world, quite honestly. So they actually, as a trade association, they have a hand in lobbying the federal government for oil and good oil and gas pipeline type legislation. They have a hand in running PR for pipeline and oil and gas companies. You can call the API to talk about Colonial Pipeline right now, and they'll tell you that how they've bestowed their safety awards on them year after year, how they're cutting edge. Basically, Colonial Pipeline would, it they act as a shield mechanism of some sort, so if Colonial Pipeline is being bashed in the media, you'll probably see lots of quotes from people from the American Petroleum Institute trying to mitigate that damage. That's part of what they do, is run PR. But the most significant thing, what they do is they help formulate the industry standards that our federal government uses as a rule of thumb to formulate the regulations that govern that industry. So to unpack that would be basically, it is a federal kind of guideline that in most cases that you can get away with it, and I'm obviously paraphrasing the language of it, is that basically in any case that you can, that they want you to use industry standards as a way to formulate the regulations. So a bunch, the welding trade association, which I like to use as an example, I think that, yeah, it's probably an acceptable thing to have a group of the country's best welders to formulate the safest and best practices of how to safely weld things. However, I don't think the oil and gas industry has earned that privilege, quite honestly, because of their history of obviously, destroying the planet and trying to cover it up over and over again. So, I think there's a huge difference there. And no, I don't think that they should be able to write their own rules, but not only are they developing the industry standards, but they actually have seats at the table at PIMSA, where, the American Petroleum Institute actually has a seat at the table of the Rules Advisory Committee. And so does Colonial Pipeline. Colonial Pipeline has an executive that sits on PIMSA's Rules Advisory Committee. Because it's structured in, 3 sections of 5. There's 5 government appointees, 5 representatives of like trade associations, and 5 representatives from pipeline companies. So really the government appointees are pretty much outmatched in a lot of ways. Even if you did have some, voices of dissent in there, they'd probably be drowned out. So I paint that picture because, yes, we have Colonial's history of negligence and damages on one side, but we've also got the government just having such a lackadaisical
allowing it.
Approach to regulation and basically letting them get away with it. And one feeds into the other, obviously. So we need bottom up, top down reform of the pipeline oversight system, and we need to make an example out of Colonial Pipeline in the public.
Absolutely. I mean, this is the nature of the fossil fuel industry. This is what they do. I mean, whether it's, Colonial Pipeline or, coal mining, all these coal mines that we have. I mean, this is what they do. They will cut corners. They will cut costs. They will sacrifice the environment. This is what they do. But the fact that we have these agencies that are being run to just kind of go along and get along, not really doing their job. I mean, that is where, I would really like to put my focus on it, or those agencies. I mean, like the PIMSA, the EPA, all these different ones that just, I mean, they're not. I was watching your interview with Facts on the Ground. It's just like, you're the Environmental Protection Agency. You are not the water quality agency. After a poisoning. Like, that's not, I mean, it's gotten so bad. I mean, but this is after years and years of everything just being eroded. And then now, like, this is what is happening. I mean, I was talking to my aunt. She's lived in around Charlotte for, I don't know, about 20 years now, just recently moved back up here. She had no idea that this happened. No idea. So, I mean, I was trying to share some of the information with her, but, it's
unfortunately,
it's a lot for just like the average person to just.
It is because, there's lots to it. When I write, and I know, like I said, like I feel like I've been running my mouth here for like half an hour just nonstop, and I have to catch myself when I'm talking about the story when I do that, because there's just so much. There's so much so many facts that you wanted to get out there, because I feel like every statistic, from the inspection percentages to, how many miles did they check for cracks, to the number of incidents over the past, all of those stats just paint the very real picture. And apparently the federal government agrees with me for once on something, and that is the fact that Colonial Pipeline isn't safe at all. And my whole thing is, like, you know, I like to say that in a perfect world, I would say no pipelines, right? Because there'd be no need for them. In the real world, I would say no new pipelines, but the pipelines that we do have are probably not going to go anywhere. But we're the richest, so you know, so-called the richest country in the world, most advanced country in the world. These pipelines that we do have that do currently operate ought to be operating not only at like the most tip-top shape that you can think of, but the companies that operate them basically should have no choice but to operate them in that fashion. I mean, that's where I get to make an example out of Colonial Pipeline, not DAPL. And this is where I've been drawing a lot of correlations with Dakota Access, because I don't. Before I get on this little tangent, I just want to make clear that I do feel that the Dakota Access Pipeline is a worthy cause for people's protests and organizations for sure. However, it's had one incident since May of 2020. One. In that same span, Colonial Pipelines had around about 10, including the 1.2 million gallon spill. So while one spill is one spill too many, the fact of the matter is that Colonial Pipeline is the imminent threat. So if you care about DAPL, you might be asking, well, why should I care about Colonial? Dakota Access Pipelines right here. It's the big story. Everybody's on it. Well, unfortunately, even though there's been lots of calls, and you know, he could always prove me wrong. But since DAPL is actually a functioning pipeline, actively distributing fuel, it's just at that stage, it's almost impossible to shut them down then, because now you're affecting more than just the company that owns it. So Colonial Pipeline, on the other hand, like I said, is a decrepit old mess that's been neglected for years and is leaking out of, you know, every little nook and cranny that you can think of. And given the fact that we both can probably see the reality that both Dakota Access and Colonial will both exist in 20 years, if we don't do something about Colonial, make an example out of Colonial now, then DAPL is going to look exactly like it in that 20-year time. And then now we got two problems. But if we show Energy Transfer, the company that owns DAPL, if we show them by throwing Colonial out in front of everybody and saying how they've been doing business will no longer be tolerated. And if you want to stay in this game, then you're going to have to play by our rules and no longer write your own. If we can effectively, basically, use Colonial as a mechanism to, hey, if you do business like this is what's going to happen to you, and find either Colonial out of existence or basically just, you know, basically, I mean, there's numerous ways to go about it. You know, I'm not a federal regulator. I don't know all of the options that will be available. But there are definitely avenues for change here. And if he wanted to, Pete Buttigieg could walk into work tomorrow morning and order a top-down review and overhaul of his entire agency, because it falls under his purview as Secretary of Transportation. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, though, it doesn't seem like pipeline infrastructure, though it is critical infrastructure and is classified as such. It's also national security risk if you really want to get into that kind of area. Unfortunately, it doesn't seem like the Biden administration has that as a priority right now, because the infrastructure plan, so far as I can tell, reading through the summary, even though I don't know if there's been an actual bill that's been introduced yet, so I can look through the text of that. But from the summary that the White House has released, I don't see the word pipeline anywhere in it. So, you know, we'll have to see how that goes. Like I said, they could always release the bill text, which is always going to be like, you know, a million pages, but, you know, we can still quickly search that to find out, okay, is there anything in here at all that's discussing maintaining oil and pipeline systems? But, you know, who knows? We'll see how it goes.
Yeah, I mean, we'll see. But I mean, just the fact that, and I think this is a common thing that we see with, especially with mainstream media, is that, you know, like you were saying, you know, this isn't being talked about. This is, you know, this isn't even on the list of things to talk about eventually, because they want something that they can wrap up in like, the like a racial kind of thing, which is what they do with, I mean, and of course we should care, right? I mean, given our history of how terrible we've been,
Mm-hmm.
to indigenous people,
Mm-hmm.
to African Americans. I mean, like, yeah, of course. But they want to frame it as in it's happening just to this specific group of people that the majority of, a lot of Americans, I don't know about majority, but a lot of Americans don't give a damn about.
Right.
Right. And they don't tell them about how it's happening in their own backyard. Like they just make it seem like, oh, it's a problem for this little group over here. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And this is, I mean, when it comes to either drinking water, EPA, you know, these pipelines, I mean, this is happening everywhere, everywhere. I mean, even in California, it doesn't matter if you're red state, blue state. I mean, your state has something in it and it's
Mm-hmm.
going to poison you. I guarantee it. Guarantee it.
Absolutely, and that's a great point. That's actually, and I 100% agree with you. Is that, when you look at, Dakota Access, okay, while that might run through a bunch of red states, right? The Dakotas, right? It's got the land dispute issue, right?
Mhm.
And that's what's driven that story. And I was kind of appalled, and I was like appalled by the Obama administration's response to that, just letting it play out, or however they phrased that. And basically we witnessed these protesters just getting beat up by private security, attacked by dogs, all sorts of shit going on up there. It was crazy. And it led to an operational pipeline. I mean, that's where we're at now. The DAPL is up and running. But so it's but that's that. I hate to say it, it's a sexy story, right? Or it's sexier story than because whenever you can use the indigenous people's story, like politicians love to do, i.e., like Elizabeth Warren, and they look. Media is only going to cover what's going to give them ratings. By and large, politicians are only going to talk about what they can raise money from. There's not going to, and they look at that honestly. And I mean, yes, North Carolina, while if you knew people that live here would know that intricately we're a very confused but purple state. Because we constantly elect like Democratic governors, but we vote red for president. It makes no sense how we do things. We're all just very sad and confused here. But
We go back and forth too. So
but what we do that. But if you look at the last electoral map or the last two electoral maps, you're going to see a red state, and that kind of kills it as far as what especially mainstream media is going to want to talk about. Democratic politicians, by and large, aren't going to talk about this type of thing. Like, look, I mean, even though we have so many that ran on a platform that was down with fossil fuels, Green New Deal this, Green New Deal that, oil companies need to be held accountable. Well, here's your chance, right now. Instead of continuing to harp on DAPL, which, I mean, yeah, it's a good cause and you should always oppose it. But I mean, we have bigger fish to fry, and I hate to put it that way, but we literally have an issue going on, and we know that politicians don't do anything without public pressure to do so. So until we can get the pressure on the politicians, we'll never get the pressure on Colonial Pipeline to clean up their act, or even have a chance to do so. And this has been a disheartening part about it, because the story broke as far as the discrepancy in the release volume, that the 1.2 million gallon number, that makes it by far the largest pipeline spill in the last 21 years for sure. But going back farther, it's I believe I read from multiple sources, that from NC Policy Watch and from EE News, both have said that this pipeline spill is the largest non-tanker related gasoline pipeline spill ever. Right.
and not on the mainstream media.
Right. Nobody's talking about it. I've tried to reach out to numerous activists, prominent ones at that. I've gotten in touch, or it's even funny. I had 2 chapters of the Sunrise Movement get in touch with me, asked me for information on the subject, which I gladly provided, even though I'm not a huge fan of theirs. But again, we're on the same side of an issue here, and they want to use their organizational strength to mobilize for this issue. I'm not going to stand in their way. So I provided them this information. Nothing. Misty over at Facts on the Ground got a hold of Bill McKibben, was managed to actually get his attention on the article that I wrote, and he said, "Hey, yeah, I'll slip it into my article at the New Yorker," which he did. But he also dedicated as many sentences to it as he did the tweet, telling us that he would. Wow. And he put it down, so it was just like a little byline. It was almost like he just didn't even want to talk about it, or he definitely didn't put any effort or detail into it at all. He was like, "Oh yeah, this happened and nobody knows about it." And guess what? Thanks to the little bit of thought I put into it, nobody still knows about it, because you didn't bring any attention to it.
And this is a massive story. I mean, just the information that we've been talking about right here. I mean, and there's got to be a whole lot more that we haven't even found out yet, right?
Yeah.
I mean, to what, a couple of sentences? I don't know how you could possibly condense this down, otherwise just to say, oh, a thing happened, moving on. I mean,
but
you're not doing your job with that.
Absolutely not. And I mean, especially if it's something you know about, and it's one of the largest land-based gasoline pipeline spills in the history of the country, and you dedicate a tweet to it. And it's not like Bill McKibben's tweet isn't going to send something viral. Like a tweet from AOC would get Colonial Pipeline trending in the top 10 on Twitter. Mm-hmm. Same thing with Bernie Sanders. Two politicians, by the way, that I keep calling out because they're two politicians that ran several, two campaigns now for AOC, but Bernie Sanders, for as far as we can remember now, he's ran on environment. AOC, one of the most prominent, probably most, especially social media wise, right? Bringing attention to issues is something AOC can do very well just because of her follower base. She can use social media better than any politician, give or take, the former president. But quite honestly, that's why, I have huge problems with her. I'm not a fan of any politician really. But I do acknowledge that they have strengths and they have platforms, and that, if you claim to care about holding oil and gas companies accountable, if you claim to care about the environment and getting off of fossil fuels, there's no greater example you can give as to why we need to start really getting away from fossil fuels and make it serious. Because have this 1.2 million gallons spilled into the Mississippi River, or have they spilled into, say, if it had just come from a different pipe altogether and spilled into the San Francisco Bay? If everybody remembers, or if anybody remembers, a few weeks back, there was the 600 gallons of Chevron oil that spilled in somewhere near the San Francisco Bay. There was a lot of video footage, and you saw the oil floating in the water. If you can remember that footage, just remember that was 600 gallons. Now imagine what 1.2 million gallons would look like floating off the coast of the beach, or of the San Francisco Bay, or any other body of water. Imagine 1.2 million gallons of gasoline rushing down the Mississippi River. Just imagine. And the federal government says that this could happen at any point throughout the entirety of the structure. DAPL, I hate to say it, but I mean, the stats back up. They've had one incident since 2018. They're also brand new. So that has something to do with it. But while it's a big political story, it's something that's going to get you a lot of clicks. It's something you can donate. You're going to drive donations for, definitely. The real imminent threat right now, you want to stop DAPL. I mean, DAPL exists, DAPL functions. I don't see it getting shut down by executive order, and that's pretty much the only way it would get shut down. And I just don't see that happening. I'm not a Washington insider. I just got common sense. I mean, because you can't shut down Colonial for longer than a few days at a time, because you're going to spike gas prices throughout the entire Eastern Seaboard. We're talking literally like $5, $6, $7 a gallon, and that's not going to hurt Colonial Pipeline, because they're backed by Koch Industries and Royal Dutch Shell. They're going to reopen, and they got all this tariff money. I mean, they're going to be fine.
Mhm.
What that $5, $6, $7 a gallon gas does to the people through all those states is it hurts the people that, hey, I've got $5 extra in my pocket. I need to put that in my gas tank to get to work.
Oh, and when gas prices go up, the cost of everything goes up. So I mean, it's like a snowball
Right.
effect. Which I mean, this is why they love to wrap everything up in identity politics, is because well, now it's not everybody's problem. It's just this group over there, and they don't have to do anything to fix even that the problems for that group. So for the Native Americans, they don't have to get rid of DAPL. They don't have to fix the water in Flint, but they get all this attention in the media for reporting, and saying all the right things. And as far as AOC and Bernie goes, I mean, we're going to hear a lot of crickets from them for the next at least 4 years. It's
Well,
unfortunately,
yeah.
even though they've got this massive platform that there's so much potential for, I mean, them just in particular, but all these people, and they just sit around and do nothing. And I don't know of any other job that you could get by with that.
Yeah, and you make decent money. About it was like 160K or something a year, or I could be wrong on that. I don't know. But
All the
no,
things they deny us, they get it.
yeah, for sure. But I think that there are opportunities for reform, but the best way to go about it is like a domino effect. It starts with us, right? It starts with reporting, then it's amplifying that reporting, and having people actually become aware of the situation, because just so many people that aren't aware, and you get everybody that becomes aware. Hopefully you can get all of those people to shout it at their favorite politician or activist group or celebrity or whoever it is that you like or has a massive platform. All it might take is a couple to get the ball rolling, it just to get some eyeballs on it. And like I said, without public pressure, there will be no political pressure to get Colonial Pipeline back going again. And like, again, going back to like the gas price thing, is that, like I said, I acknowledge that I wish that there was no new pipelines, because we've gone way too long without putting any kind of serious money or thought. I don't care what anybody says about the electric vehicle boom. There's been no serious breakthroughs in fuel for my entire life that I can think of. And because a lot of time big oil's killed a lot of those projects. But there's but our government funding and our we have we have the highest technology on the planet, and we still can't figure this out. And I feel like that's a problem. But until that happens, the reality is that we have to still rely on the pipeline system. And we can't just shut down an active pipeline that's not one that's 60 years old. But before we wrap up, you bring up like the identity thing. Look, if if DAPL is important to you because of the tribal land dispute and the First Peoples dispute, totally I totally am behind that, because yes, they are and have been not only just forgotten by our government, but just totally just I don't know how else to put it. They've just been shit on for as long as this country has existed, and even further back than that. But the government has basically tried to just give you something every 60, 70 years and say, hey, okay, yeah, we did our due diligence here. But the pipeline itself is called the Colonial Pipeline. And I know that's because it's supposed to run through the colonies, but also the fact that it was built back in the 60s. A lot of it was. So can you imagine what uh, the land disputes from back then, and if there was even really any kind of recourse for a lot of the landowners that had to give up their property? I can tell you 100%, as a lifelong North Carolina resident, there are multiple tribes that are actively still living in this state. And not only we have a huge and rich history in Native American culture in North Carolina, and obviously all of these states that we're talking about, Virginia, West Virginia, and even point south, even east, or west towards Tennessee, Kentucky, stuff like that. I mean, this whole area, and I can just only imagine what they did back in the 60s when they built this darn thing, because
yeah, I mean,
and
yeah,
it's
that's a
actually
good
something I'm
point.
interested in looking into. But I'm just, how do you even begin to find those records? I mean, but
Oh no, I mean, there probably wasn't even any records to begin with. I mean,
right.
and there's some real horror stories out there when it comes to like eminent domain
Hmm.
and the pollution, all this stuff. I mean, I've I could probably go on for 2 hours about all the land theft that they've done here, all the things that they've done. I think Eleanor Goldfield covered it in her documentary where they went and all these courthouses burned down, and if you couldn't provide your deed, then it went to the coal mining companies. Your
Oh,
land
wow.
did. So just all these random courthouses just happened to burn down, right?
Hmm.
Just a coincidence. So I mean, this happens all the time, and it's not just here. I mean, it happens up in Canada. I mean, there's a reason why we have cancer alleys, right?
Hmm.
And it's
Yep.
not. This isn't just a North Carolina problem.
Nope.
You
No,
mentioned the
absolutely.
Mississippi. All this, it's going downstream.
Hmm.
Everything that we're doing to the environment, it's going downstream. So I mean, by
Absolutely.
the time all these other states pile in all their pollution, I mean, you got to think about how disgusting it must be at the end of that river, by the
Yeah.
end of that waterway.
I
So
mean,
I
it's
mean,
all heading down to the Gulf. I mean,
yeah.
it's probably, and yeah, you're right. It's probably abysmal. Uh, so I mean, look, as far as eminent domain, that's kind of a small underlooked story that's been kind of going, that kind of broke a couple weeks ago, that Jesse over at Facts on the Ground kind of brought to my attention, was that uh, there's a small natural gas, or I'm sorry, a small crude oil pipeline. I think it's crude, running from Pennsylvania to New Jersey. It's just on like 100 and some odd, 150 miles or so. It's called the Penn East Pipeline. And they're in a Supreme Court battle with the state of New Jersey over the fact that should the pipeline company Penn East be able to use eminent domain to take state-owned New Jersey land to run the pipeline. And for those wondering, the Biden administration's stance after shutting down Keystone, they're backing the pipeline company in the Supreme Court case. So take that for what you will. I mean, that's the administration's stance so far, is that, okay, let's shut down Keystone. Why? Because it was pretty much already dead, because the Supreme Court pretty much killed it earlier in the last year. But Biden killed it. And it was an easy political win for him, right? Because if you would have asked somebody at that time, or let's just say December 31st, 2020, you took a poll of most people in the country, did like a Family Feud style survey, 100 people. The top two answers of the question, name a natural gas, or name a pipeline in general. Most of the points, like 99 or 95 of the points, would probably be stuffed in the top two answers, and those would be Dakota Access Pipeline and Keystone. So, I mean, obviously, it's an easy win for him. But on the smaller things, the stuff that's not going to get the media coverage, the little pipelines that want to snatch up land, uh, Biden administration is totally signing off on that, and they're backing them in the Supreme Court, basically saying, "Hey, this is acceptable to us." And I think that's what we're going to get from the Biden administration on not just environmental issues, but pretty much everything going forward. It's going to be the big stuff, the easy stuff. We're going to make a show of it. We're going to take our easy wins, and then when nobody's looking, just like in typical political fashion, we're gonna do our dirty work. And so far, that's happening. But to close out on the Colonial Pipeline issue, I really appreciate you amplifying the story. We're just kind of waiting. We're waiting for Colonial Pipeline to respond to their latest wave of allegations from federal regulators. We're waiting on federal regulators to come down with any potential fines or anything like that. And we're just waiting on activists, politicians, and the media to cover this thing. So again, thank you, and just keep up with me for further
Yeah,
developments.
if you have any updates whatsoever, I mean, you're always welcome here to talk about whatever it is that you're working on. You do excellent work. So yeah, I mean, it's been really great to have you on. And I would recommend to anybody watching, research the industries in your state.
Mhm.
Know your fossil fuel industries. Know who the players are. I mean, in a lot of states, it's Walmart sometimes, but there's a pipeline somewhere, right?
Mhm.
So just
Yep.
always be very aware of that, and you have to keep up on it, because you cannot rely on even your local independent, your newspapers or anything like that. I mean, it just does not get reported.
Yep. Your local news. Your local news is
It ain't local.
understaffed and undermanned. Quite honestly, in a lot of cases, unless you live in a big market, they need all the help they can get. And also the fact that like I said, or like you just said, this is know the power players in your area. And activism works, guys. As a North Carolinian, I can tell you for a fact activism works. After years of activism, and not for myself, I wasn't out there in the streets with a sign, but I'm talking about just activists in general. You know, even though I opposed this project, I opposed the pipeline in question, but seriously, after years of activists taken to the streets, taken to the courts, and disputing it, Duke Energy and Dominion Energy had to abandon the Atlantic Coast Pipeline project that was scheduled to run through. Activism does work.
You can win
So
for sure.
it worked. It killed that entire project from even happening. Even though the Supreme Court had okayed it and everything, it works, guys. So don't give up. Amplify the stories. Just know that this is going on, and that the environment is basically, there could be a leak happening right now. So pressure your politicians to get out there and let's get this reform done. So before I get out of here, shameless plug, you guys can find me on Twitter and on Rockfin. Twitter is for, I break a lot of little stories on Twitter, big articles on Rockfin. Both of the handles are the same, at Robleto Fire, ROBLETO Fire. And if you or any of your viewers have any free time tonight, and need something to do, I always encourage everyone to take about 5 minutes of your spare time, read up a little bit on the effects of autism, especially in children, so we can just help build a more inclusive, educated, and accepting society for our neurodiverse brothers and sisters out there. But with that being said, that's all from me tonight, guys. I really appreciate you.
Well, it was excellent having you on. And anybody that wants to help contribute, you can donate on Rockfin as well, right? Are you on Substack?
I'm not on Substack. No, okay. You can, if you feel compelled to, yes, you can contribute via Rockfin. But the best thing you can do for this story particularly is just spread it.
Yes.
Talk about it.
Yeah, get the information out there. Okay. Well, thank you. That was so very, very, very informative. And yeah, please come back anytime.